Welcome to Embracing Autism IRL. Today, I'm thrilled to welcome Kaelynn Partlow, an autistic therapist, author, advocate, and speaker who is passionate about educating others and breaking down barriers for the autistic community. You may recognize Kaelynn from Love on the Spectrum, where she shared her journey with authenticity. In addition to her advocacy work, Kaelynn uses her expertise to support and empower other autistic individuals. In today's discussion, we'll be tackling autism myth busting, dispelling common misconceptions, and shedding light on the realities of autism. Join us for an engaging and enlightening conversation about fostering understanding and inclusion. Welcome, Kaelynn.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us. I wanted to start off by getting to learn a little bit more about you and kind of introducing you to our audience. So, can you share a little bit more about your journey into autism advocacy and kind of what got you here?
Yeah, I was diagnosed with autism at the age of 10. We went through, I guess, a lot in terms of my educational history. I was, at the time when I was diagnosed, attending a small private school. And when they received all the paperwork for my diagnosis, they said they couldn't help me anymore. So my mom homeschooled me up until about middle school. And I don't know, not unlike everybody else, I had some challenges with, going through puberty and my relationship with my mother. And at that time, it was pretty obvious that I needed something different from homeschool. So she enrolled me in Project Hope Foundation's school program. And that was really kind of a turning point for me in terms of understanding my diagnosis and also coming to realize that I really liked interacting with children and I really liked helping the younger kids at the school because I was in high school when I joined. So I guess I don't know, that had a really big impact on me. And then kind of fast forwarding after graduation, I became a therapist to work as an RBT with the school after graduation. And then in 2022, I got the opportunity to participate in the Netflix series Love on the Spectrum. And that was a complete and total game changer. My social media took off and it kind of put me on the map in terms of autism advocacy. And so things have just kind of taken off from there.
That's pretty cool. So you mentioned really quickly, you said Project Hope. Can you just let us know what exactly that is?
Yeah, Project Hope is a nonprofit autism service provider. They offer a variety of services from ABA to OT and speech. And they also have a school program as well where you can graduate with a high school diploma, not just a certificate of attendance, which is really awesome. They
That's
also
pretty cool.
offer services for adults as well because it's a lifespan of autism services. They recognize that autism doesn't end when you turn 18. And so they have employment and day services, which is really cool.
So it's kind of like a school with all the accommodations baked in already, it sounds
Yep,
like.
that's
That's
right.
pretty cool. So I really wanted to talk to you about autism myth busting because I've been following your social media accounts and there's a few different posts that you've made that kind of caught my eye. I was a late diagnosed autistic adult. I'm also the parent to two autistic kids who are 5 and 6 now. We have an 8-month-old that's kind of we're not sure yet, but autism is very much so intermingled in our family. And one of the things that I've run into is kind of having to kind of confront people kindly about certain stereotypes and myths that are out there that comes to the topic of autism and what people think autism is versus what it's not. So I wanted to get an idea or a sense of, from your perspective as an autistic individual who is also in the realm of autism advocacy and even with the whole RBT background and all that, from your perspective, what autism myths have you encountered the most and why do you feel like they're harmful?
Oh gosh, there's so many. I don't even know where to start. I guess one of the bigger ones that seems to persist, especially online, is that this belief that everyone is a little autistic, or that if you do an autistic thing, that makes you automatically autistic, or that if you relate to my videos or if you relate to a lot of autistic content, you are automatically autistic. And I like to use the analogy that just because you know how to speak German doesn't in itself automatically make you a German person. They're all it's human behavior, right? Hand flapping is a human behavior, pacing is a human behavior, being upset is a human thing. We all do it. It's the intensity, and intensity is just frequency and duration. And so I think it's kind of crazy that we're still having to have these conversations that no, not everybody is a little autistic. So that's one that is persistently frustrating, I would say.
Definitely. I've heard that one a lot. I think it's interesting that it seems like previously, like at least when I was younger, the issue seemed to be more that people weren't as aware of autism. They didn't really know what autism was, or it was kind of a taboo topic. Now it seems it's almost like the complete reverse, where it's been, on the spotlight. There's been shows like Love on the Spectrum and things like that. And so now more and more people do fall into this category of like, well, then everybody's autistic, or, there's like the complete opposite problem
Yeah,
now,
we
it seems
swung too
like.
far the other way.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So I was wondering, what do you think about this one common myth that I've heard a lot? It kind of bothers me, but at the same time, I can sometimes see why people would perceive it that way. And that is the myth of autistic people lacking empathy. What are your thoughts on that?
That's tough because I see why you can get there relatively easily, especially if you've spent any amount of time in an autism specific classroom where you've got a group of autistic children interacting with each other. It's easy to sometimes look at these interactions and think, oh my God, these people feel nothing for the other people around them. What is wrong with them? They don't have empathy, but that's really not the case, because in order to, first of all, express your empathy, you have to have a certain amount of communication skills. And second of all, in order to also express and then have your empathy, you have to have perspective taking skills. And oftentimes when I'm working with kids, it's not a lack of empathy. The empathy is there and it's intact. They just can't access it because they're having such a hard time with perspective taking. And that's a skill that can be taught. That's a skill that can be learned and practiced over time. And it's something I think everybody on the planet could get a little bit better at, not just autistic people. Autistic people just tend to struggle with it at a more profound level than neurotypical people. But yeah, it's a thing that can be learned, and the empathy will follow once you can kind of get those perspective taking skills up to speed.
Yeah, I think what I've realized is that people kind of have one idea of what empathy looks like and what it means. But what I've really learned is that with autistic people, empathy can look totally different from like neurotypical empathy. And
Mm-hmm.
sometimes you just miss it. Like you don't realize that it's an act of empathy because for the
Right.
autistic person, what they're doing in their mind, we're trying to be empathetic.
I love that. I agree.
So yeah, you've seen that too. You've noticed
Yeah,
that as a trend.
definitely.
Yeah. So one of the other things that I've noticed is that there's a lot of misconceptions in general about autism. One of them being that autism is a childhood disorder or that it only occurs in children. Have you heard that misconception? Is that something you run into commonly? And if so, what are your thoughts on that?
I run into it on occasion. I wouldn't say it's one of the bigger ones, but it still happens. And I guess my response would just be that people don't grow out of autism, we grow into it. We learn to kind of manage the things that are hard for us. We grow into our unique skill sets. We develop the things that maybe were harder for us. Um, so, yeah, I mean, it's kind of like a dumb phrase, but I think that it really works to solidify the point that people don't grow out of autism. It doesn't end just because you've turned 18. You don't grow out of it, you grow into it.
Yeah, that was actually one of the things that I was thinking about was the whole reason that we put autistic kids into therapies is in hopes of some sort of improvement. So by default, doesn't that mean that you're going to see changes down the road? So wouldn't you expect them to appear less autistic, quote unquote? It just seems strange to me that people would just assume that as a human being, whether you're autistic or not, you're going to make some sort of progress in life, regardless of
Right.
how wide that range of progress is. That's just natural human, I think, evolution. I don't know.
Yeah, we're definitely supposed to grow and change.
So there's this debate in the autism world. You've probably seen it, you've probably come across it. And it's kind of been this debate between the quote unquote higher functioning autism versus quote unquote lower functioning, higher needs, lower needs. Different people call it different things. And there seems to be kind of like two different stereotypical views of autism. One is that if you are autistic, you're like this savant genius. So you think Rain Man is always brought up, that sort of thing. Or you think the opposite and you think of like a severely disabled child who can't even function essentially. And then you get all the harmful stereotypes that come from that end. Have you seen a range of these like stereotypes? Have you seen kind of like a better understanding of autism, or do you feel like this is still something that needs some fine tuning when it comes to the whole myth busting of what autism looks like or is?
Yeah, I definitely like that word, that fine tuning, because people tend to live in extremes. I feel like autistic people get accused of this a lot, but I think it's kind of a more widespread issue than people care to admit. And just kind of like you said, it's either terrible, horrible, they are in diapers, they are not communicating. And I mean, that does happen where people have very profound needs, or the other extreme where they're basically a Sheldon Cooper. And it's hard to combat that because on social media, too often it's not necessarily that we're only seeing content that put out extremes, but that's what gets watched, that's what gets views, that's what gets likes, is those extreme examples. And it can definitely be harmful when people start to draw conclusions from seeing those extreme examples.
I have seen you mention a little bit about profound autism on your social media. Can you kind of define what profound autism is for my audience and talk a bit about your perception on that when it comes to this current debate of profound autism either needing to be a new diagnosis or not needing to be? Like, what is the need and the discussion happening around this term?
It was a group of parents, and it's meant to be a modifier, not necessarily an additional diagnosis, and not necessarily added to the DSM-5, at least not yet. They are wanting to use it to describe a group of autistic individuals who are not able to communicate. That means they've been exposed to AAC and sign and typing. None of it is working. It could only be applied to somebody after the age of 8. So this is not going to apply to younger children. These are people who have had access to supports and services and are not able to make progress in terms of communication. By definition, these are people who would have an IQ testing below 50. And there's certainly a lot of debate on the efficacy of IQ testing for autistic people anyways. An IQ less than 50 is very challenging. And then the other characteristic of profound autism is somebody who needs 24/7 supervision to stay alive, not to stay content, not to stay regulated, to stay alive. These are people who are grabbing bees. These are people who are running into traffic. These are people who might consume poisonous substances if they're not monitored by someone who can keep them safe. So this is a distinction to, the argument is to kind of allocate some specific types of supports and services that might not otherwise be available. But there is certainly a fair and equal debate against this specific terminology as well.
Do you mind sharing a little bit on that side of things?
Yeah, I guess the argument against using it would be that a lot of organizations kind of, once they hear level 3 autism or profound autism, they say, oh, we don't serve those people. We don't have the resources to provide the behavioral support that these folks will need. I guess my take on that is organizations are already doing that. Saying this individual has profound autism is really not going to change it. I've seen it with my own eyes where organizations say, yeah, we support autistic people, we support inclusion, we support diversity. And then you show up with someone who needs more support and they say, oh, wait a minute, not like that. But that's happening anyways, despite the label. And that can happen, I mean, when they meet the person. So having the label or not is not really going to change it in my view, but that is one of the arguments against it. Another argument against it is that it focuses solely on deficits and doesn't focus on ways that the person contribute positively or, makes a positive impact in their environment. It just solely focuses on ways that they are challenging. And that's definitely a challenging one because, I mean, it's true, but
Yeah.
it's also descriptive. So I don't know.
Yeah.
It's a hard one.
It's funny because like us having the kind of the flip side of things. So our kids were originally kind of level 3, level 2. They've kind of shifted up to level 2, level 1 in the most recent years. And we've kind of worried about profound autism having the opposite impact than what you mentioned. But now I'm thinking about what you're saying. In terms of like insurances, for example, like being denied potentially insurance if you're not considered profoundly autistic. I'm concerned because insurance companies don't tend to have the best of intents, and they might use something like that as a way to be like, well, we don't have to cover you guys anymore. So that was like one of the concerns that I personally had. I do feel like it's a big debate and something that still needs a lot of like discussion though.
If anything, I would be afraid that insurance companies would deny coverage to those with profound autism because statistically speaking, these are individuals who are not historically making progress in their therapies. Again, these are people who are not able to communicate with any access to any sort of technology or device. Any modality of communication is not accessible to them. So insurance companies are maybe more likely to deny coverage because it's like, well, we're spending how much money for you to get years and years of support and services, and you're not making any progress, you're not able to fade out at all. So if anything, insurance companies are going to deny coverage to the profound. And it seems to circle back to that all the time, where the most vulnerable in our community are consistently being the ones most harmed. And we're scrambling to protect ourselves rather than them, which is really
Yeah, that's
frustrating.
that's true. Like that's something that I hadn't considered before, that you're right, like they could just see it as kind of like a money drain and not want to be involved. So there's also a little bit of debate that I've seen you discuss too. In case you can't tell, I follow you a lot. I see a lot of your posts. They're really short, snappy, quick, and easy to understand. So if y'all haven't followed her yet, go ahead. I'll share the social media accounts later. But what is this distinction that you've talked about between autistic self advocates and autistic advocates? Is there really a distinction between the two? And like, what does that mean to you?
I think everybody could be thought of as an autistic self advocate. To me, an autistic self advocate is someone who advocates for themselves, for what they need, for the accommodations, just strictly speaking for themselves as an individual. And that's a skill that oftentimes has to be taught. And it's really important, obviously. We need to be able to tell others what we need and communicate our preferences and the things that help us stay comfortable and happy and, whatever. But to me, I really don't like personally to be introduced as an autistic self advocate, because it's not about myself. I might be the conduit. I might be the example that I use when I'm, describing something, but it's not for me. I'm not making the world a better place for Kaelynn Partlow to live in. I'm trying to make the world a better place for my community to live in. And to me, an autistic advocate is someone who has autism and is an advocate. An autistic self advocate is just an autistic person who has learned to advocate for strictly themselves.
Well, that was put well. I definitely never really caught the nuance there because I never really went too much into this self-advocacy route. I went more into advocating for my kids. And ever since running into my own diagnosis later on a couple of years ago, though, it has kind of evolved to that. And I've noticed this kind of very minor distinction, but I think I fall in the same camp as you in terms of just saying, autistic advocate, because it is kind of for everyone. You're absolutely right there. So, one of the things that parents tell me all the time is that there are a lot of challenges in terms of these myths that are prevalent within their families and their communities. And one of the things that they have also been challenged with is kind of the myth that your kid will outgrow autism, or that it's not autism, or that whole thing like, oh, it's just a late talker, and doctors are just getting heavy-handed with these diagnoses, and we're kind of overdoing the autism. Do you feel like that's a myth, or do you feel like there's like some mixed truth to that, or like how would you respond to that?
Just that doctors are overdiagnosing autism.
Or also when people say basically like, oh, your kid will outgrow it, don't worry about it, that sort of thing, when your kid does get an autism diagnosis.
So more like the avoidance of a label.
Yeah, like it's not real, it's just kind of socially structured.
Mm. I would say that, avoiding a diagnosis or avoiding even exploring the possibility that there's a diagnosis to be had is oftentimes robbing a child of an opportunity to get support, because unfortunately, in our current system, the only way to get support and services, especially in a school environment, is to have an official diagnosis. And so without that, you'll never know what sort of progress your child could have made if they were sufficiently supported.
Yeah, unfortunately, getting those diagnoses is so difficult too.
Oh,
Those
yeah.
wait times. I don't know, and what I don't know if you mind sharing what state you live in.
Yeah,
Do
I'm in
you
South
mind?
Carolina.
How is the wait list there? Do you know?
Um, I don't know what it is currently. I can't imagine it's fantastic. South Carolina is not known for our progressiveness in any subject at all, ever. So I can't imagine it's great. Um,
Yeah. I'm right
yeah,
next to
I would
you.
imagine
We're
there's
in
quite a long
Georgia.
list. Yeah.
Yeah, so I know that for our kids, when they had to get a diagnosis, the wait list was 2 years. That was when we were back in Maryland. So it was a 2 year
Wow.
wait list. Yeah, so I just assumed down here it would probably be longer, but I didn't have to get them diagnosed down here.
Yeah.
So I also wanted to know, from your perspective, what do you feel is kind of like the most harmful perception of an autistic individual? Like if there's one thing you could tell people to like never say this about autistic people or autism, or like don't believe this about autism because it's so, harmful in your opinion to the autistic community or autistic individuals. Is there any one thing that you feel is kind of just like a big faux pas?
Yeah, but like kind of indirectly, a lot of times when I encounter people who maybe don't necessarily work directly with the autistic community, maybe they had an autistic employee, or maybe their, brother-in-law is autistic, they've got a connection to an autistic person in their personal life somehow, but they're not necessarily involved with the community. I would say that one big issue that I haven't seen talked about a whole lot, but I come in contact with in person, is people will meet one or two autistic people and decide whatever is about them applies to everybody else. I did a training with South Carolina Vocational Rehab. I trained the entirety of their 400 statewide staff, which was quite an adventure. But one thing that we kept running into is they would say, well, employers will hire one autistic dude, and maybe the one autistic dude had some, difficulties understanding relationship boundaries and maybe was engaging in some sexual harassment towards the customers, towards his coworkers, and then they've drawn the conclusion that all autistic men do that, which is not true. But it's relatively common when people meet one autistic person, they apply whatever goes on with that person to everybody else, and that's just not true. And so, like, I know we've said it a million times, and it feels like I'm beating a dead horse here, but we are all different. Everybody is different. I don't know how many times we're going to have to say it for people to believe it, but it sounds simple, but that's what I think people need to know.
Yeah, it's interesting how people have an easy time applying that logic to like neurotypical people, but then when you're dealing with somebody with a disability, suddenly it's like that, like people forget that, that still applies.
Yep.
Um, I like that you mentioned a little bit more that kind of career side of things. I was wondering because as you are kind of like in the workforce, you're an autistic adult, there are different challenges. I definitely have run into them myself. It was part of the reason why I pursued a diagnosis was to get certain accommodations. And I wanted to ask you, what do you think are the biggest, I guess, myths when it comes to autistic adults in the workforce specifically?
Um, that it's too difficult to hire us, that it's going to be too expensive to deal with accommodations, and it's going to be too much trouble and not worth the time. And I don't think that's a fair thing to say about any group of people at all, ever. So I don't understand why it's an acceptable thought process to have about autistic people. Because you wouldn't say that about any other group of people. That would be horrendous. So it's tough to kind of fight that battle.
Yeah, that was actually something that we kind of discussed in an episode a little bit ago about how now not only are people kind of getting discriminated against in the workforce in that way, but we're also seeing it in the school in terms of the public's opinion on whether or not autistic individuals should be even allowed to be at school if they're having
Mhm.
like meltdowns or anything like that. I know in our local community, it was recently in the news and we were talking about there was this one kid who, in the comments section for his meltdown that he had at school, everyone was saying that he should be homeschooled, that he shouldn't have a right to be in the education system, and that essentially you need to learn how to behave in order to be able to earn the right to exist or participate in the world. And that's kind of why I wanted to talk to you a little bit because it kind of made me start thinking about like, well, what are all these myths and stuff that people have, this misconception of autism? Have you run into anybody who thinks that way? Because I've seen these people online, but I haven't run into them face to face. And I was just wondering with the advocacy work that you do or being heavily involved in therapies or talking to parents, have you run into people who seem to have this kind of negative perception of like if an autistic person can't behave or can't do X appropriately, then they don't belong in this space?
Yeah, I mean, I hate to say it, but those stereotypes are kind of alive and well at South Carolina Vocational Rehab. I just keep that was a challenging experience to have to go and train their staff that weren't entirely open to being trained. And their perception was oftentimes, no one else is allowed to wear headphones. Why should he be allowed to wear headphones? If he can't cope without headphones, he doesn't deserve to be here. And so working really hard to kind of change that and explain to people that that's not how this works. Yeah, it is out there for sure. I've definitely run into it. It's not common, but it is out there.
Do you feel like you were able to make any leeway, or do you feel like despite, having all this information and stuff sharing with them, do you feel like they probably left thinking the same way? I just feel like sometimes these people are kind of harder to make some leeway if, you know?
Yeah, no, there's definitely a certain crowd. A lot of times it's the older crowd who've maybe been in the field longer than I've been alive, have a harder time receiving information, especially from me. But there are certainly people who have had their minds changed and been able to receive the information in a way that made sense to them, and were able to make progress because of that. So I think it just, again, we kind of come full circle back to, and everybody's different. Everybody's an individual. So it's certainly not a lost cause.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like if you can change one person's mind, like that can have a ripple effect, so it's totally worth it.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yep.
what is it that you would advise parents if they could take one simple step today to help advocate for a more inclusive and understanding world when it comes to autism and accepting their autistic children? What is that one step that you would advise them to take?
I think that's a tricky one because there's so many different ways you could go with it. But if it were me and I were a parent, which I'm not, but if I were, one thing that I find very valuable is to have kind of quick language to be able to describe certain phenomenons that affect me or affect those around me. Even those little sayings that we like to use in the community, for example, different, not less, or that you grow into autism, not out of it. Those sorts of things can be really helpful in, I don't know, I guess just describing the things that affect our lives. And those little bite-sized tidbits of language can really kind of serve as an icebreaker and a way to get people to understand where maybe they wouldn't before.
And some of the people who are listening, they have older kids as well, teenagers, 14, 15, who are autistic, who might potentially be listening with them as well. So if you were giving your younger self one piece of advice, maybe there is that 15-year-old girl listening who's autistic. What piece of advice would you give them as they're growing into that, or you give yourself as your 15-year-old version?
For me personally, if I could go back in time and talk to myself as a teenager, I would tell myself it gets better and you are going to be okay. Because as a teenager, I think a lot of us have this experience of, really kind of low self-esteem and really I mean, all teenagers to a certain extent are worried about the future and worried about what adulthood might look like for them. But teenagers with disabilities, I think, are especially worried because they've still a lot of times not encountered social success in their school environments or otherwise. And that can really make a challenging self-view for sure. So I guess if I could go back in time, I would tell myself that it does get better. You are going to be okay. You will have enough experiences to be able to build the skills you need, and you will run into people who will be your people. You will find your people.
That's definitely something I struggled with growing up too. You have to kind of learn that if the people don't want you, they're not your people. You gotta find the people that want you.
Right.
I don't know about you, but I found those people in some nerdy inner circles. Was that your experience at all? I'm just curious. Like I
I
found
tend
my
to get
friends.
along with nerds, but I'm not.
Yeah.
I guess I'm not like what you would consider a nerd, but I tend to get along with nerds. Yes.
Okay, because I was kind of like in the geeky crew, but like I met my husband at a comic convention, but I
Really?
wasn't yes, but I wasn't the geekiest person there. I was probably the most normal looking person there. So one last thing that I want to ask you. Our podcast is called Embracing Autism, and the concept of embracing autism means something different for every person that we ask. So I wanted to ask you, from your experience and your perception, what does embracing autism mean to you?
I guess to me, it means not feeling self conscious about the things I need to succeed. For example, as a teenager, when I realized if I wanted to participate in large events, so like sporting events, concerts, those sorts of things, if I wanted to attend those things, I was going to have to wear a pair of headphones. Otherwise, it was completely intolerable and therefore inaccessible. And so, one piece of advice I would give would just be to accept the things that you need in order to support yourself and don't feel bad about them. I guess that's what it means to me, is just, this is where we're at. This is what my disability means for me, and that's okay. And it's not an easy place to get to. Just because, I tell you it's okay doesn't mean that you're going to feel like it's okay. But just, that's, I guess, eventually where we would like to be.
Do you mind my asking, like, how long it took you to get to that space where you were okay with it?
Um, I don't know that I'm like, you could say that I've officially arrived. There are certain times where I am still self-conscious about it. I feel like maybe I shouldn't be, but that's just, I guess, the reality of it. I don't know that we're ever fully accepting everything about ourselves at any given time. But if I had to give a rough estimate, I would say, I mean, from teenager to young adult, so like, I don't know, 10-ish years, give or take.
Nice. I think I can relate to a lot of what you're saying, so that's why I kind of get curious. So one more thing, I want to just open up the door to give you an opportunity. Is there any other question or topic that you would like to discuss that I didn't already give you the opportunity to discuss?
Oof. I don't know.
I know it's a wide open door.
That's a big one.
Sometimes it's too much. I know.
It's too big. I got nothing.
That's a little big for us neurodivergents. But I just wanted to let you have the opportunity just in case. Sometimes people have something they really want to share. Okay, so then I want to make sure that our listeners can listen and find you wherever you are on social media. Where can they find you? What are your social media accounts, websites, all that good stuff?
I am everywhere that you can consume social media. If TikTok doesn't get banned, I'm on TikTok. I'm on YouTube. I'm on Instagram. I'm on Facebook. I am wherever your social media is.
Okay, and I believe you did give us autistic angle for Facebook.
Yep.
At Kaelynnism, that's two N's, right? KAELYNNISM for our audio only listeners. For YouTube, and then for Instagram, it's Kaelynn VP, and Kaelynn is spelled KAELYNN for everyone listening on audio only. Well, thank you so much, Kaelynn, for joining us on the podcast. It was really great having a chat with you. Really enjoyed this conversation. I hope it was good for you too.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Have a good one.
You too. Bye.
Bye.